The first time I saw Coda, I was elbow-deep in a dead calf. I need to say that plainly because that's how it happened. August of 1883, the hottest summer the territory had spit out in a decade, and I was kneeling in the shade of my barn with my arm inside a stillborn calf I was trying to pull from a heifer who'd been laboring since dawn. Flies everywhere. Blood on my forearms up past the elbows. Sweat had soaked through my shirt so completely it clung to my ribs like wet paper. I keep a ledger, have since I was 19, little leather-bound book I carry in my vest pocket. I write everything in it. Feed costs, rainfall, head count, the price of barbed wire in Tucson. But I also write things that aren't numbers, observations. Things I notice about people that I can't say aloud because saying them would mean I care, and caring is expensive out here. I'd written in that ledger the night before, heifer restless. Calf may be breech, prepare for loss. I was right about the loss, wrong about being prepared. The calf came out wrong, turned sideways, cord wrapped. The heifer screamed the way cattle do when something goes badly, this low guttural sound that doesn't belong to any animal you want to think about. I pulled the calf free and it was already gone. Blue tongue, still chest. I sat back on my heels in the hay and flies and just breathed for a minute. My hands were shaking, not from the effort, from the waste of it. Another death I couldn't stop. That's when I heard the drag. A specific sound. Boot on packed dirt, then a pause, then a scraping slide like someone pulling a heavy feed sack. Regular, rhythmic, getting closer. I didn't look up right away. Figured it was Emmett from the feed store delivering the oat shipment I'd ordered. But Emmett walked normal. Emmett didn't make that sound. I looked up. He was standing at the edge of my barn door. Young, maybe 22, 23. Apache. That was the first thing most people in Copper Bend would have said, and they would have said it like it was a problem. But I'd lived near the San Carlos reservation long enough that Apache faces didn't startle me. What caught my attention was everything else. His left leg was wrong. Not missing, that would have been simpler, somehow easier for the eye to process. It was there, but it hung at an angle that made your stomach tighten if you looked too long. The knee bent slightly inward, the foot turned, the whole limb dragged behind him like it belonged to a different body and had been sewn on as an afterthought. He used a walking stick, mesquite, hand-carved, the top worn smooth and dark from years of his palm gripping it. His right leg did all the work. Every step was a negotiation between balance and forward motion. But his upper body, that was something else entirely. Shoulders broad as a fence rail. Arms thick with the kind of muscle you don't get from vanity, you get from compensating. His hands were enormous, not swollen, not clumsy. Just large and capable looking. The kind of hands that could hold a horse's hoof steady or crack a walnut without thinking about it. He looked at me, looked at the dead calf, looked at the heifer who was lying on her side now, breathing hard, eyes rolling white. "She's going to bleed out," he said. His voice was quiet, not shy quiet, contained quiet. Like he'd learned a long time ago that most people didn't want to hear him talk, so he made every word count. I stared at him. "Who are you?" "Coda," he shifted his weight on the walking stick. "I'm looking for work." I almost laughed, not at him, at the universe for its timing. I was covered in blood, kneeling next to a dead calf, losing a heifer, short-handed since my last worker had quit 2 weeks ago after a disagreement about wages that was actually a disagreement about whiskey. And now, a young Apache man with a ruined leg was standing in my barn asking for a job. "I don't have work," I said, which was a lie. I had more work than 2 men could handle. I had so much work I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in 3 weeks. I said I didn't have work because the truth, the thing I wrote in my ledger that night in smaller letters than usual, was that I looked at his leg and made a calculation. The kind of calculation everyone made. The kind where you measure a man's body and decide what he's worth before he's opened his mouth twice. Coda didn't react to the refusal. Not a flinch, not a sag in his shoulders. He just nodded once and looked again at the heifer. "She needs pressure on the bleed," he said. "Left side below the hip. There's a vessel there. If you don't stop it in the next few minutes, she'll be gone too." I looked at the heifer. I hadn't noticed the blood pooling under her hindquarters. I'd been so focused on the calf, I'd missed it. Coda hadn't been in the barn 30 seconds, and he'd seen what I hadn't. "How do you know that?" I asked. He didn't answer the question. He just limped forward. That drag, slide, pause, drag, crossed the barn floor to the heifer. Lowered himself to the ground in a controlled, practiced motion that told me he'd been getting down and getting up on that bad leg his entire life, and pressed both of those enormous hands against the heifer's side. right below her hip bone. The heifer flinched. Coda didn't move. He held pressure with his full weight leaning through his palms, his bad leg folded awkwardly beneath him, his face close to the animal's flank. He was murmuring something. Low, rhythmic, not in English, not trying to be heard, just steadying, the way you'd talk to a child who's scared of thunder. The bleeding slowed. I could see it. The dark pool stopped spreading across the hay. I sat there watching a man I'd refused to hire save my heifer's life. He held pressure for nearly 20 minutes. Didn't shift, didn't complain, didn't ask for help. I brought water and he shook his head without looking up. When he finally eased his hands away, slowly checking, the bleeding had stopped. The heifer's breathing had calmed. She wasn't dying anymore. Coda wiped his hands on his pants and began the process of getting up, walking stick planted, right leg under him. A push, a sway. And then he was standing, slightly off balance, catching himself the way I imagined he caught himself 100 times a day without anyone noticing. "You know cattle," I said. "I know what bleeds." There was something in the way he said it, a depth that had nothing to do with livestock. I wrote it down later. Coda knows what bleeds, means more than he said. He turned to leave. That dragged slide pause across the barn floor. I watched his back, the way his spine stayed straight even though every step must have cost him something I couldn't calculate. "Wait," I said. He stopped but didn't turn around. "How many places have you tried for work?" 14. He said the number without weight, like he was reporting rainfall. "Nobody hired you." "No." I knew why. I knew because I'd almost done the same thing 5 minutes ago. 14 men had looked at Coda's leg and done the math and decided the answer was no. Not because they were cruel, most of them anyway, because they were practical. Ranching is legs. Ranching is walking miles a day, chasing strays, climbing fence lines, running when something goes wrong. A man who can't run, can't climb easily, can't move fast, the math says no. But the math didn't account for what I just watched. A man who could read a dying animal in 30 seconds, who could hold pressure for 20 minutes without flinching, who could lower himself to the ground and get back up on a leg that didn't work over and over without complaint, without asking for accommodation, without making it anyone else's problem. "I can pay 30 a month," I said. "Bunks in the back room off the kitchen, meals included, work starts at dawn." He turned around. His face didn't change, no smile, no relief, no gratitude. Just a slight shift in his eyes, a focusing, like he was reassessing me the same way I was reassessing him. "I don't need special treatment," he said. "I'm not offering any. And I don't want pity. Good, I'm fresh out." The smallest movement at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement that we understood each other, at least on the surface. That night after Coda had settled into the back room and I was sitting on the porch with my ledger and a lamp, I made 2 entries. The first was practical, hired hand, Coda, Apache, 30-month plus board. The second was underneath, written smaller, the way I always write the things I don't fully understand yet. 15 men looked at him. 14 saw the leg. What am I seeing that they didn't? I didn't know the answer yet. I wouldn't know for weeks. What I knew was this. My heifer was alive because a man everyone had already dismissed had walked into my barn and done what needed doing without being asked, without being paid, without knowing if I'd spit on him or shake his hand. The next morning I woke at 5 and found Coda already in the barn. He'd fed the horses, mucked 3 stalls, refilled the water troughs. The heifer was standing, shaky but standing, and he'd made a compress out of clean cloth and secured it against her side with twine, the kind of improvised field medicine that spoke to experience I hadn't asked about. He was slow. I won't pretend he wasn't. Every task took him longer than it would have taken a man with 2 working legs. Crossing the yard was a journey. Climbing the fence to check the far pasture was a production. He'd hook his walking stick over the top rail, grip the post with both hands, haul his weight over with his arms doing the work his left leg couldn't, land on the other side and retrieve the stick and keep going. It was hard to watch the first few times, not because it was pathetic, because it was relentless, because there was no quit in it. Because he did it with the same expression every time, focused, interior alone with the effort, not inviting you to notice and definitely not inviting you to help. I learned quickly not to offer help. The one time I reached for his elbow when he stumbled on loose ground, he pulled away so fast you'd have thought I'd burned him. "I've got it," he said, not angry, final. So I stopped offering. I stopped watching too, or at least I stopped letting him see me watch. But I wrote about it every night in the ledger. Small things, details. Day 3, Coda repaired the Southgate hinge. Took him an hour. Would have taken Emmett 20 minutes, but Emmett's repair last spring broke again in a month. Coda's won't. Day 5, Coda with the horses. They come to him, never seen anything like it. He stands still and they walk over, like they know something I don't. Day 8, Coda won't eat inside the house. Takes his plate to the bunk room. I asked why. He said habit. Didn't push it. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Copper Bend was 40 buildings and 200 opinions, and the opinion about Coda was unanimous and immediate. Earl Grady at the general store said it first. The way Earl said everything, leaning on his counter with a chew in his lip, and a grin that made his wisdom look like meanness. You hired the cripple Indian, Caleb. That's a new kind of charity. It's not charity, it's employment. Man can't walk straight. What's he gonna do, limp your cattle into the pen? I didn't answer. I bought my supplies and left. But it followed me. At the post office. At the farrier's. At Sunday services where Mrs. Prescott, who organized the quilting circle and considered herself the moral compass of the territory, touched my arm and said, "Caleb, it's very Christian of you to give that poor boy something to do. Just be careful he doesn't hurt himself." Poor boy. She said it with such warmth, such genuine compassion, that it almost didn't sound like an insult. Almost. Coda knew. He never said so, but he knew. I'd catch him sometimes, standing at the edge of the yard when someone rode up, and I'd see the way he planted his walking stick and squared his shoulders and waited. Waited to be looked at, measured, and filed away in whatever drawer people kept for things they'd already decided about. One night, about 2 weeks in, I was sitting on the porch writing in the ledger and Coda came out. He almost never came out in the evening. He stayed in his room, or in the barn with the horses, existing in the spaces between spaces. But that night he sat on the step below me, his bad leg stretched out at that angle, and he didn't say anything for a long time. The crickets were loud. The sky was doing that thing it does in August in the territory, purple and orange at the edges, deep blue overhead, stars appearing one at a time like they were being lit by someone who wasn't in a hurry. My mother carried me on her back for 11 miles when I was 4, he said, no preamble, no context. My leg was already bad, born that way, the bone twisted. The soldiers came to move us. She could have left me. Some of the others told her too, said I'd slow them down. She wrapped me in a blanket and she carried me. I stopped writing. 11 miles through the canyon, in the heat, with soldiers behind us. She didn't put me down once. His voice was the same, that contained quiet. But there was a tremor in it now, buried deep, the way a crack runs through stone. You can't see it from the surface, but you know it goes all the way through. She died the next winter, fever, I was 5. I didn't say I was sorry. I'd learned by then that Coda didn't traffic in I'm sorry. He traded in I'm still here. The people who raised me after, they were good. They taught me to use my hands because my leg wouldn't carry me. My uncle said, "The ground will always be hard for you, so learn to do everything you can without leaving it." He held up his hands, those big, scarred, capable hands. "I can fix anything," he said, not bragging, reporting, the way he'd reported the number 14. "Leather, wood, metal, bone. I can set a horse's leg. I can build a door that doesn't stick. I can sharpen a blade so thin you can shave with it." He paused. "But nobody asks what I can do. They see the leg and they already know everything they need to know." I looked at my ledger. All those entries. All those observations I'd been collecting like specimens, cataloging him, studying him, as if understanding could be organized into columns and rows. I started. "You almost said no too," he said, not accusing, just honest. "I saw it the moment you looked at my leg, you did the math." He was right, and he'd known it from the first second. "Yeah," I said. "I did." And then the heifer was dying. And then the heifer was dying. We sat there in the growing dark, not looking at each other, listening to the crickets and the horses shifting in the barn and the vast, indifferent quiet of the desert stretching out in every direction. I made one last entry in the ledger before I went to bed. I did the math was wrong. 3 months in, I stopped noticing the drag. I want to be precise about that because precision matters when you're trying to describe the moment a person stops being a category in your mind and starts being a person. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way weather changes in the high desert, slowly, imperceptibly. And then one morning you step outside and the air is completely different and you can't point to the exact moment it shifted. At first, the sound of Coda moving was the loudest thing on the ranch. That drag slide pause across the yard, across the barn floor, along the fence line. I heard it in my sleep. I mapped my days around it. I'd know where he was by the sound, the way you know where a clock is by the ticking. He was in the barn. He was crossing to the well. He was coming up the porch steps, that particular labor of stick plant, right leg push, haul, settle. And then one morning in November, I was repairing a bridle at the kitchen table, and Coda came through the back door and sat down across from me and said, "The bay mare's got a stone bruise on her left front," and I realized I hadn't heard him come in. Not because he'd gotten quieter, because my ears had stopped sorting his movement into a separate category. He moved the way Coda moved. That was all. I wrote in the ledger that night, stopped hearing the drag today. Not sure when it happened, not sure what that means about him or about me. It meant something about both of us, I think. The work had settled into a rhythm. Coda couldn't do everything, and we didn't pretend otherwise. He couldn't run down a stray calf in open ground. He couldn't climb the windmill when the pump seized, which it did twice that fall. He couldn't move quickly when something went wrong, a kicked fence rail, a spooked horse, the kind of emergencies where speed is the difference between a close call and a disaster. But here's what I learned, and what the people in Copper Bend never bothered to learn because they'd already made up their minds. Coda had spent his whole life preventing the emergencies that other men spent their lives reacting to. He could read an animal the way literate men read a newspaper. He'd stand at the edge of the herd and watch, just watch, not moving, that walking stick planted, his weight balanced on his good leg, and after 10 minutes he'd tell me which cow was going to calve early, which one had a hoof problem she was hiding, which bull was getting territorial and needed separating before he hurt something. He was right every time. Not mostly right. Every time. How, I asked once, genuinely baffled. He shrugged. I can't chase them, so I have to know what they're going to do before they do it. It was the most practical thing I'd ever heard. And underneath it was something enormous. A lifetime of forced observation, of standing still while the world moved around him, of turning the thing everyone called his weakness into a kind of intelligence that no one with 2 good legs would ever develop because they'd never need to. His hands were a separate miracle. He could repair anything, like he'd said, and he did it with a patience that bordered on meditation. I'd watch him work on a broken harness, his fingers moving with a precision that made my own hands feel clumsy and approximate, and I'd realize that this was his version of running. This was where his body made sense to itself, in the careful, intricate, unhurried work of making broken things whole. He rebuilt my entire south fence over the course of 6 weeks. Not just patched it, rebuilt it. New post holes dug by hand, he'd kneel, brace his bad leg behind him, and swing the post hole digger with arms that had been doing the work of 4 limbs for 20 years. New cedar posts, cut and shaved and set so true they looked like they'd grown there. Wire strung tight as a fiddle string. When he was done, that fence was the best-built thing on my property. The best-built thing in the county, probably. Earl Grady rode out one afternoon to deliver a salt block, and I saw him stop his horse at the south fence and stare at it. Just stare at it. He didn't say anything. But I saw him run his hand along the top rail, testing it, and I saw the look on his face when it didn't budge. He didn't mention it to me, didn't compliment the work. That would have meant reconsidering his opinion of Coda. And Earl Grady had never reconsidered an opinion in his life. But the salt block got delivered with a nod instead of a smirk, and that was something. The trouble came in December, the way trouble always comes, sideways, from a direction you weren't watching. A man named Harlan Polk had a spread about 8 miles north of mine. Bigger operation, 40 head, 2 hired men, and a reputation for being the kind of rancher who measured his own worth by the weakness of everyone around him. Polk was the man you went to if you needed to borrow a post driver. Polk was also the man who'd remind you he'd lent you the post driver every time he saw you for the next 6 months. He rode onto my property on a Tuesday afternoon with both his men flanking him like it was a military operation. I was in the barn. Coda was in the yard, splitting kindling, another task he'd adapted to his body. He'd sit on a stump, brace the log between his knees, and swing the hatchet with an accuracy that made the wood fall apart like it had been waiting for permission. Polk reined up. His horse was big, a 16-hand sorrel that he kept overfed because it made him look more important. He looked down at Koda from the saddle with the particular expression of a man who has just confirmed something he already believed. "This the cripple I've been hearing about." Koda didn't look up. He set another piece of kindling and swung the hatchet. "Caleb," Polk called toward the barn. "Come out here." I came out, wiped my hands on a rag, took my time. I didn't like being summoned on my own land. "Harland, I need to talk to you about the water rights meeting next week. But first," he gestured at Koda like he was indicating a piece of equipment he found insufficient. "I don't know what kind of statement you're trying to make, hiring this boy, but it doesn't reflect well on the rest of us." "The rest of you? The ranchers in this valley. We've got standards. People in Tucson hear that Copper Bend ranchers are hiring lame Indians to work cattle. They'll think we can't attract real hands. It's bad for business." Koda kept splitting kindling. His face hadn't changed, but his grip on the hatchet had shifted tighter, the knuckles paling. Such a small thing. "I wouldn't have noticed it a month ago." "Koda's the best hand I've had in 6 years," I said, which was true, though I'd never said it aloud before, not even to Koda. Polk laughed, not a cruel laugh exactly, a dismissive one, the sound a man makes when he believes the world is simple and someone is trying to complicate it. "Best hand, he can't even walk to the pasture without that stick. He can fix a fence better than any man in the territory. He can read cattle better than you can read a brand. Caleb," and he saved a heifer that was bleeding out the day he showed up, while I was standing there with my thumb in my ear. Polk's expression tightened. He didn't like being interrupted, he didn't like being wrong. And he especially didn't like the implication that a man with a ruined leg could do something he couldn't. "I'm asking you as a neighbor to reconsider," he said, and his voice had dropped into that register men use when they want you to understand there's a threat behind the request. "This valley works because we do things a certain way." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, which meant I would not keep it in mind. Polk knew it. His jaw worked. He turned his horse, not sharply, but with enough force that the sorrel's hooves threw dust, and rode out with his men behind him. When the sound of hooves had faded, Koda set down the hatchet. He still hadn't looked up. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Do what?" "Defend me." "I wasn't defending you. I was telling the truth." "There's a difference." He looked at me then, long and searching, the way he looked at the cattle, reading something beneath the surface that I probably couldn't see in myself. "Most people don't know the difference," he said. That night I wrote in the ledger. Polk came, made threats shaped like advice. Koda heard every word and didn't flinch. I flinched. Who's the stronger man? 3 days later, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in an afternoon, and the first real cold hit. Not the gentle chill of early winter, but the bone-deep, iron-sky cold that kills calves and cracks water troughs, and makes you question every life choice that led you to a piece of land where the earth is trying to murder you 6 months out of 12. We lost 2 calves the first night. Found them at dawn, huddled against the fence line, frost on their eyelashes gone. Koda knelt beside them, that careful, practiced lowering, and put his hand on the smaller one's side and didn't say anything for a long time. "We need to move the herd closer," he said finally. "Into the canyon draw, the walls will block the wind." "That's a 2-mile drive." "I know. In this cold. I know." He was looking at me with that expression that wasn't asking permission. He was telling me what needed to happen and waiting to see if I'd object. I thought about his leg. 2 miles of rough ground in freezing wind. It would take him 3 times as long as it would take me, and the cold would hit him harder because his body was working harder with every step. I also thought about the cattle. The rest of the calves, what would happen if we didn't move them? "All right," I said. We started at first light. I took the left flank on horseback. Koda took the right on foot because he couldn't ride well enough for cattle work. His bad leg made it impossible to grip with his knees, and he refused to be tied into a saddle because, as he put it, "If the horse goes down, I need to be able to fall free." So he walked 2 miles in 6-degree cold through scrub and rock and frozen mud, driving cattle with his voice and his walking stick and the sheer stubborn force of his presence. The cattle listened to him. They always listened to him. He'd make a sound, a low, clicking call that came from somewhere in his chest, and they'd turn, like they owed him something. Like they'd agreed to a deal I wasn't part of. It took 4 hours. By the end, Koda's lips were blue and his bad leg had stiffened in the cold until he was barely dragging it, more like hauling a dead branch. Every step was an act of will so enormous that watching it made my own body hurt in sympathy. But he didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He didn't ask me to take his side. When the last cow was in the draw and the makeshift barrier was up, Koda sat down on a rock and put his head in his hands. I'd never seen him do that. I dismounted and walked over to him. I didn't touch him. I'd learned that lesson. I just stood nearby, close enough that he'd know I was there, far enough that he had room. "My mother carried me 11 miles, he said, his voice muffled by his hands. "I know. Sometimes I think about what that cost her, her back, her legs, 11 miles with a child on her back and soldiers behind her." He lifted his head. His eyes were red from the wind or from something else. "And I think I have to earn that every day, every step. I have to be worth the 11 miles she carried me." My throat closed up. I don't have a better way to describe it. Something in my chest locked and my eyes burned, and I stood there in the freezing wind, unable to say a single useful word, because what do you say to that? What possible combination of English words addresses a debt that profound? "You are," I said, and it sounded thin and insufficient, and it was the truest thing I'd ever said. He nodded once, wiped his face with the back of his hand, reached for his walking stick. "We need to check the barrier," he said, and stood up and kept going. Christmas came. I'm not a man who makes much of holidays. They're just days with better food and worse loneliness. But I'd bought a ham in town and made a passable effort at a meal. Set the table for two. Koda usually ate in his room, but that night I didn't give him the option. "Sit," I said, putting the plate down. He looked at the table, at the two plates, at the candle I'd lit because my mother used to light one at Christmas, and some habits outlive the people who started them. He sat. We ate in near silence, which was how we did most things. But it was a different kind of silence than the early days, not the silence of two strangers sharing space. The silence of two people who'd stopped needing to fill the air because the air between them was already full. After dinner, I brought out a package wrapped in brown paper. I'd made it in the barn when he wasn't around, working late by lantern light, cursing my clumsy fingers. "What's this?" he said. "Open it." He unwrapped it. Inside was a new walking stick. I'd made it from ironwood, the hardest, heaviest, most indestructible wood in the territory. I'd sanded it smooth, carved a grip that matched the shape his hand made when he held his old stick, and fitted the bottom with a copper cap so it wouldn't split on rock. He held it, turned it, tested the weight, ran his thumb along the grip where I'd tried to match the contour of his palm. He didn't say thank you. He said something better. "It's the right weight," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word just barely, the way stone cracks when the fissure finally reaches the surface. I wrote in the ledger that night, not words, just a line, a single horizontal mark across the page. I don't know what it meant. I think it meant that something had shifted that I didn't have language for yet, and the line was a placeholder for whatever word I'd eventually find. I still haven't found it. The fire started on a Thursday in February, and it started because God has a sense of humor that borders on cruelty. I know that's not a proper explanation. The proper explanation is that a kerosene lamp fell in the hay barn on Harlan Polk's property at approximately 2 in the morning, likely knocked over by one of Polk's barn cats. And by the time anyone smelled smoke, the entire north wall was involved. But the deeper explanation, the one I wrote in my ledger weeks later, when I could hold a pen without my hand shaking, is that the universe has a way of constructing exactly the situation that will break you open and show you what's inside, and it doesn't care whether you're ready. I woke to the smell, not the pleasant campfire smell of burning cedar, but the acrid, chemical stink of hay and kerosene and paint and tack leather all going up at once. I was out of bed and on the porch in my union suit before my mind had fully caught up with my body, and what I saw stopped me cold. The horizon to the north was orange, not sunset orange, living, moving, eating orange, Polk's spread. Koda was already in the yard. He'd heard it before I had, or smelled it, or felt it, I never asked which. He was standing with the ironwood stick, staring north, his face lit by a glow that shouldn't have been visible from 8 miles away, but was, because the fire was that big. "Winds from the north," he said. 4 words, and they rearranged every priority I had. Wind from the north meant the fire wasn't staying on Polk's land. It meant brush, dried grass, stands of mesquite and creosote, all of it tinder-dry from a winter with no rain, all of it between Polk's barn and my south pasture. A grass fire in this wind could cover 8 miles in a few hours. Less if it hit the dry creek bed, where the dead cottonwood leaves were piled 3 feet deep. "We need to move the cattle," I said. "We just moved them." "We need to move them again, south past the ridge, on the other side of the rock face." Coda looked at me. In the orange light, his face was unreadable, but his body wasn't. His right hand was gripping the walking stick so hard the tendons stood out like cables. He knew what I was asking. 3 miles in the dark over rough ground, with a fire coming behind us and no guarantee we could outrun it. No, not we. He couldn't outrun anything. I could get on a horse and be past the ridge in 40 minutes. Coda on foot on that leg in the dark, it would take him 2 hours, maybe more. "I'll drive them on horseback," I said. "You should get to the road, head south toward town." "No, Coda, you can't drive 40 head alone in the dark. They'll scatter." He was right. One rider can push a herd on a straight, open path in daylight. In the dark, on uneven ground, with the smell of smoke driving the cattle half-mad with panic, one rider would lose half of them. "Then I'll lose half of them." "No," he said again, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard. Not stubbornness, I'd heard that plenty. This was something older, deeper. A decision that had already been made somewhere inside him before the words reached his mouth. "I'll take the right flank, same as before. On foot in the dark, with a fire behind you. I've been behind worse." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say it was too dangerous, that his leg would slow him down, that the smart thing, the math, said to leave the cattle and save ourselves. But I'd learned something about math and Coda. The math was always wrong. The math didn't account for what he was. "Stay close," I said, "if the wind shifts. I'll smell it before you see it." We went. The dark was absolute. No moon clouds had been building all day, the kind of low, heavy overcast that traps heat and holds smoke down close to the ground. The cattle were already restless. They'd smelled the fire before we reached them, and they were milling in the canyon draw, bumping against each other, that low, anxious lowing that sounds almost human in the dark. I was on horseback, working the left side. Coda was on the right on foot, and I could hear him, that drag slide pause, faster now than usual, a rhythm pushed beyond its normal tempo. And the clicking sound, that chest-deep clicking call he used to move cattle. In the dark, with the smell of smoke thickening, the cattle followed the sound of his voice like it was the only solid thing in the world. We pushed south. The ground got rougher, loose shale, dry washes, clumps of cholla that would take the hide off your legs if you brushed against them. I could navigate around them on horseback. Coda couldn't. Twice I heard him stumble, the sharp intake of breath, the scrape of the walking stick finding purchase, the pause, and then the drag resuming. Each time my chest tightened, and each time the drag resumed, and each time I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. An hour in, the wind shifted. Not gradually. All at once, the way desert wind does, like someone had opened a door. One moment the air was still and the smoke was a distant smell. The next, a wall of hot, ash-laden wind hit us from the northeast, and the sky behind us turned the color of a forge. The cattle panicked. A stampede in daylight is dangerous. A stampede in the dark is something you survive by luck or you don't survive at all. The herd split, half bolting forward, which was the direction we wanted, and half wheeling back, running blind toward the fire because terror doesn't care about logic. "Coda," I shouted, but the wind ate my voice. I could hear the cattle crashing through brush, hooves on shale, the terrible sound of animals in mindless flight, and under it, barely audible, Coda's clicking call, steady, unbroken, coming from somewhere to my right and behind me, which meant he was between the cattle and the fire. I turned my horse, fought through a tangle of mesquite. The sky was brighter now. I could see the silhouettes of cattle against the glow, running, and I could see, barely, at the edge of the light, Coda. He'd planted himself. That's the only way I can describe it. He'd driven the ironwood stick into the ground, and he was standing in the path of the retreating cattle with his arms out, his bad leg braced behind him, and he was making that sound, that low, rhythmic, ancient sound, and the cattle were turning. Not all of them, but enough. They hit his voice like water hitting a rock, and they split around him, curving south, redirecting. A big yearling bull, 300 pounds of blind panic, clipped his left side as it passed. I saw the impact. I saw Coda stagger, grab the walking stick, catch himself. His bad leg buckled. He went down on one knee, and he kept making that sound. On his knees in the dark with a fire coming and cattle thundering past him. He kept calling them, kept turning them, kept doing the work his body shouldn't have been able to do because his spirit didn't know the word can't. I rode to him, dismounted. The heat was real now, not close fire heat, but the dry, skin-tightening heat of something enormous burning a mile away and coming closer. "Get up," I said. "I'm working." "Get on the horse." "I told you, I can't ride well enough to." "You're not riding. I'm putting you on the horse and I'm walking. We go together or we don't go." He looked up at me. In the firelight his face was all plains and shadows, the sweat-cutting tracks through the ash on his skin, his eyes bright with effort and pain and something else, surprise maybe. The surprise of being met. "Your leg," he started. "My legs work fine. Get on the horse." He got on the horse. I adjusted the stirrups, put the reins in his hands. He sat crooked, his bad leg couldn't grip, so he leaned right, bracing himself with one hand on the saddle horn. But he was up. And from up there his voice carried farther, and the clicking call reached the cattle that my shouts couldn't, and we pushed south together, me on foot, him on horseback, the fire a living wall behind us. The last mile was the worst. The ground rose toward the ridge, rocky and steep, and my horse was laboring under Coda's weight on the incline. The smoke was thick enough to taste, gritty, bitter, the kind of smoke that coats the inside of your throat and stays there for days. My eyes streamed. My lungs burned. Coda was coughing, deep, racking coughs that bent him over the saddle horn, but between the coughs the clicking sound continued. Always the clicking sound. We crested the ridge at 4:15 in the morning. The cattle, not all of them, but most, more than I had any right to hope for, poured over the top and down the other side into the rocky basin where the ground was bare and the fire couldn't follow. I counted as they passed. 31. We'd started with 38. 7 lost. 7 animals I'd raised from calves, named in my ledger, tracked through seasons and sicknesses and storms. Gone. I stood on the ridge and watched the fire eat the valley behind us. My ranch was down there somewhere. The barn, the house, the fence Coda had built. The porch where we'd sat in the quiet. All of it in the path of something that didn't care what it consumed. Coda slid off the horse. The dismount was bad. His bad leg hit the ground first and folded, and he went down hard, the walking stick clattering away on the rocks. I started toward him and then stopped because he was already getting up. Right leg under him, hand on the horse's flank, push, sway, standing. He retrieved the walking stick, walked to where I was, stood beside me. We watched the fire together. 7, I said. I know. The barn's gone, probably the house. I know. I should have been doing calculations, loss assessments, insurance claims if I had insurance, which I didn't, where to shelter, what to salvage, how to rebuild, the math. My ledger was in my vest pocket, and for the first time in 15 years I didn't reach for it. I couldn't have done this without you, I said. Coda didn't answer for a long time. The fire crackled and roared in the valley below, so loud it sounded like the earth itself was clearing its throat. 14 men, he said. 14 men looked at me and saw a man who couldn't walk. You looked at me and saw a man who wouldn't stop walking. My eyes burned, not from the smoke. That's not strength I gave you, I said. That's strength you carried in here. And I didn't gesture at his arms or his hands or any of the parts of his body that had adapted and compensated and overcome. I put my hand on his chest, over his heart. And I left it there for a moment, feeling the beat, steady, strong, relentless, the same rhythm as that clicking call, the same rhythm as the drag slide pause, the same rhythm he'd been carrying his whole life while the world counted his steps and called them insufficient. He put his hand over mine, just for a second. Then he pulled away and looked back at the fire. Dawn came gray and smoky. The fire had burned itself out against the ridge. The bare rock stopped it where timber couldn't. We came down from the basin in the early light, Coda on foot again, insisting, the horse following behind us like a dog. The ranch was still there. I stopped walking when I saw it. The fire had come within 200 yards of the south fence, Coda's fence, the one he'd rebuilt with ironwood posts and perfectly strung wire, and stopped. A firebreak I hadn't planned, a strip of rocky ground where nothing grew, had diverted the flames east. The barn was standing. The house was standing, scorched, ash-covered, surrounded by blackened earth that looked like the surface of the moon, but standing. Koda's fence was untouched. He walked up to it, ran his hand along the top rail, the way Earl Grady had months ago, but differently. Not testing, greeting, confirming that a thing he'd built with hands that the world undervalued had endured a thing the world couldn't control. "Good fence," he said. I laughed. It came out raw and cracked and slightly unhinged. The laugh of a man who's been up all night running from fire with a half-lame companion and 31 head of cattle, and has discovered that the thing he was most afraid of losing is still exactly where he left it. "Yeah," I said, "good fence." Polk lost everything. Barn, house, outbuildings, 20 head. His 2 hired hands quit the next day, took their wages and their horses and rode south without looking back. Polk stood in the ashes of his property and looked like a man who'd been hollowed out from the inside. He showed up at my ranch 3 days later, on foot. His horse had bolted in the fire and hadn't come back. He'd walked 8 miles on a road covered in ash. And when he came into the yard, he looked 10 years older than the man who'd sat on his big sorrel and called Koda, the cripple. Koda was in the barn, repairing a harness that had been smoke-damaged. Polk stopped in the yard when he saw him. They looked at each other, the man who'd tried to get Koda fired and the man who'd turned a stampeding herd in the dark with nothing but his voice and a walking stick. Polk looked at me, his mouth opened and closed. He was trying to ask for something that his pride couldn't phrase. He started. "I know what you need," I said. I looked at Koda, Koda looked at Polk. And I watched something happen on Koda's face that I'd never seen there before, not forgiveness, exactly, because forgiveness implies the debt has been acknowledged, and Polk hadn't acknowledged anything yet. Something more like recognition. One man seeing another man's suffering and choosing, despite everything, not to look away. "There's a bunk in the back room," Koda said. "I'll move to the barn." "You don't have to," Polk said. "I know I don't have to." That was all. No speeches. No apologies. No redemption arc wrapped up with a bow. Just a man with a ruined leg offering his bed to a man who tried to ruin his life, and doing it not because it was owed, but because it was needed. Because Koda had been on the other side of that equation his whole life, the side where you need something and no one offers. And he knew what it cost to stand there with your mouth open and your pride in pieces. Polk took the bunk. He stayed 3 weeks. He worked alongside Koda in near silence, and I watched him learn what I'd learned, that the drag slide pause wasn't a limitation, it was a cadence. That Koda's hands could do what most men's whole bodies couldn't. That strength isn't the absence of weakness, it's the refusal to let weakness write the final line of your story. On the 4th day, Polk repaired a water trough that had cracked in the cold. He did it badly, crooked seals, sloppy caulk. Koda came over, looked at it, and without a word knelt down and redid the joint. Correctly in half the time. Polk watched. His face did something complicated, embarrassment, resentment, and then slowly, like sunrise, respect. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "My uncle," Koda said. "He told me the ground would always be hard for me, so I learned to do everything I could without leaving it." Polk nodded. He didn't say anything else. But the next morning when Koda crossed the yard, Polk was watching, not the leg, not the drag, not the stick. Watching the way Koda's head turned toward the pasture, reading the cattle, seeing things Polk had never seen on his own land in 15 years of ranching. "He's something, isn't he?" Polk said to me, not a question. "Yeah," I said, "he's something." Spring came early that year. The burned ground put up new grass faster than the unburned land, something about ash and nutrients, and the indifference of biology to human catastrophe. The cattle fattened. Calves were born. Koda delivered 3 of them himself, on his knees in the hay, those big hands guiding new life into the world with a gentleness that made the violence of birth look almost peaceful. Polk rebuilt his ranch, slowly with money borrowed from the bank in Tucson and lumber hauled from the mountains. He hired new hands, and one of them, a young Tohono O'odham man with a missing finger, was someone that the old Polk would never have considered. I didn't say anything about it. Neither did Koda. Some lessons don't need annotation. One evening in April, I was on the porch with my ledger. The air smelled like creosote flowers and warm dirt and the particular sweetness of new grass. Koda came out and sat on the step below me, the way he had that first night, his bad leg stretched out, the ironwood stick beside him. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the 11 miles. I waited. My mother carried me 11 miles, and for 20 years I tried to earn that, every day, every step, trying to be worth the cost of those miles. And he looked at the sky, stars again appearing one by one unhurried. "I think I had it wrong," he said. "She didn't carry me because I was worth something. She carried me because I was hers. That was the whole reason I was hers." His voice didn't crack this time. It was steady, steady the way a river is steady. All that power moving in one direction, smooth on the surface but deep enough to drown in. "So maybe I can stop earning it," he said. "Maybe I can just be here." I looked down at my ledger, hundreds of entries, measurements and calculations and observations, my whole life reduced to columns and rows, everything accounted for, everything weighed. And Coda, who couldn't be measured, who couldn't be calculated, who defied every math I'd ever trusted, sitting on my porch step telling me that the most important things in life aren't earned. They're given, and the only obligation is to be present enough to receive them. I closed the ledger. I'd never done that before, not without writing something. Not without recording, cataloging, measuring. But some things, the important things, don't fit in columns. They don't fit anywhere. They just exist like starlight, like the sound of breathing, like the particular silence between two people who have walked through fire together and come out the other side with their hands empty and their hearts.